So today we're going to talk about managing staff under new alert levels. As we know, this has changed at the beginning on a daily basis, didn't it? As to what we can be doing, what we should be doing. And as the alert levels change, the needs for your staff are changing. So we'll touch a bit on that. Correct employment processes are a really important aspect because the law hasn't gone away. So we do need to make sure that all of these steps that we're wanting to do to change arrangements with staff, which has become an inevitable consequence of this whole COVID situation, that those processes are being followed. So we'll talk about that, and then we'll touch a bit on health and safety obligations. Now, obviously we're on level 3, waiting for details of level 2 to come out on Thursday. After which time we'll be able to nail down in preparation for that wonderful day that perhaps we might be released from our homes into the wide, expansive lands of New Zealand. So if we start off with managing staff. So as I said, there's, we've had these different levels. There's been varying ways that people have been able to work, but if we just sort of look at level 3 for now, where employees or workplaces can work from home, then they do need to at the moment. And then it's only if you can't that workplaces have been able to open with all the associated requirements that come with operating safely and all the criteria around operating if it's not at home. So there's quite a bit there around requirements, so in a lot of different working ways that are happening. So we've got quite a few who are on the remote working side of things, and it is really important to stay connected with employees while they're remote working if you've got people in that category. There's some practical reasons. Obviously you need to continue to run business as much as possible, and obviously checking in with staff is a good way to gauge what they've got on and what they're doing. But there's also issues around mental well-being and making sure that your staff are well, and also in relation to health and safety. So there is a regulation that requires, when you've got people working from home, it requires you to manage health and safety risks and to have communication methods in place. I think most of us instinctively do that and we'll go, oh, well, thank goodness, you know, they've got an email system, that's good, that's in a communication system. And I think most workplaces have got on to the video conferencing. You know, obviously Zoom in particular has had a big upsurge, but there's lots of other programs, Skype and Teams, and that people are using. So really utilising that to get the that interaction and make sure that you have got effective communication. Not only works to make sure that your workplace is humming as much as you can, but it actually ticks off meeting your health and safety obligations, which is really important. And I think as we move into level 2 and beyond and just have more permanency around people working from home, and when I say permanency, I don't mean that they're permanently working from home, but that it's happening for much longer and not so much in an absolute lockdown situation, there is going to be an increasing need to assess those remote working setups. We've all heard the stories of the kitchen table and the sofa and bedroom, and we've just had a bit of a chat ourselves around what the unusual working setups, and that can only go on for so long. And if there is going to be some kind of permanency happening around that, we will see the requirement for workplaces to check in on that as time goes on. And perhaps the measure is once you are able to go back to the workplace but you have people staying there, then it becomes a different scenario than one where we're all forced to work at home where we are. But remote working, as we know, is not the only setup. Of course, many workers were working under level 4 and many returned under level 3. What we've learnt in terms of sort of the difficulties and things that might happen from level 4 in particular is that there are a lot of people who are immunocompromised or have immunocompromised people in their bubble. There's a lot of people who don't feel safe coming to work or just don't want to. And so there's been a lot of hijinks to sort out around that. And health and safety is paramount. And this is a key situation where we're seeing the health aspect of health and safety coming through in a really big way. We're also seeing that people have been paid to not come to work during the lockdown, and now potentially are not going to be getting as much, or maybe not anymore, to actually come to work and do some work. So we're seeing some issues around that, particularly where we don't have all of the staff back yet. So we've got some at home, maybe they're on a wage subsidy, others needing to come back to work, or others that are getting topped up. And so, you know, there's a lot of employment issues that are coming out of the effects on employment. The other things like work is variable, really variable. Got quite a few employers who are coming out of the lockdown able to work. They might have some work that was hung over from pre-lockdown, or have managed to get some work, some specific pieces of work, but so many employers are saying we just don't know how, you know, well, this might be for a defined period, or we don't know how long we're going to have this work for, and it's entirely possible that we bring people on and work will drop, or it will be lumpy. So we've been doing a lot around creating a flexible working regime so that employers can use their staff as much as they possibly can, but not have that commitment that they might ordinarily have to give them X number of hours every single week, in a situation where many of these businesses have been locked down and not earning an income for a period of time. So there's a lot of that sort of happening, and that sort of leads into sort of what's been implicit through all of that, that there's lots of scenarios where we're needing to reduce staff hours and staff pay. And that's been right through lockdown. It's happening still, in fact, even more so. Ironically, you know, some employers have been able to pay some money during lockdown, but now without an income go, well, actually we can't afford, with the little bit of work we've got, to until we build it up again, to pay full whack. So that's those are lots of things that are sort of playing into the different ways that businesses are having to get their staff to work. And of course, all of that requires a process, which we'll touch on shortly. Other, you know, fun things have been really tolerance of home situations. So people have kids, and we've heard a lot about the homeschooling, but it's not just children, it's having parents to look after, or obligations, you know, with parents not recommended to go out so much. There's people who have those obligations as well. And pets. Oh, we've seen lots of pets on the old video conferencing. So just that tolerance and understanding for staff as well, which leads to a bit of flexibility. And we all know the staff members that will deliver regardless of the situation. But there's just a need for a bit of innovation, really, in the way that we manage our staff. So, Anthony,
right,
talk about the support packages.
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. Well, as many of you already know by now, the government has introduced 2 economic schemes to assist employers and keep employees employed during the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'm just going to run through briefly what they are, and then talk about some of the things that are going on around MSD, looking into employers' use of these schemes. First scheme we have is the wage subsidy scheme. Many of you may have even applied for that, but just to recap, the scheme allows employers to apply for the subsidy for affected workers, and you receive a lump sum payment to pay employees. And that part's quite critical. The duration of the scheme is for 12 weeks, meaning that you as employers will receive a one-off payment to pay a number of affected employees during the relevant 12-week period. The wage subsidy, of course, is for full-time workers. that's $585.80 per week, and that's gross, so you need to take tax out of that. Or for part-time employees, you've got $350 per week. The eligibility for that scheme, just to recap for you, is to be able to actually get it, you have to have an actual or predicted 30% revenue drop attributed to COVID-19. The other part of it is you must ensure that you retain all named employees for at least the duration of the grant, the 12 weeks. And you'll need to use your best endeavours to top up the employees' pay who are receiving the subsidy to at least 80% of their usual income. And the government has clarified if you cannot pay the 80%, you must at least pass on the wage subsidy. And if the employee has earned less than that subsidy before COVID, then you pay them just their usual pay. So that's the first scheme that the government put in place, and it seems to have had a $10 billion take-up. Essential Workers Leave Scheme is the second one, and this scheme allows businesses to pay employees who need leave during the COVID-19 situation. The scheme was originally designed to help three groups of essential employees, and those are workers who are self-isolating because they've contracted COVID-19, or they've come into contact with somebody with COVID-19, or have a dependent that has COVID-19. That's the first category. The second is deemed at the higher risk people that have contacted that, the over 70s. If they're working, and I understand out there's an awful lot of over 70s working, driving buses and doing all sorts of wonderful things. And then we have those who have household members who are deemed higher risk of contracting COVID-19. So that's the third category. And that scheme's been available for employers since the 1st of May, last Friday. The criteria for employees is the same as the Alert Level 4 for essential workers, and employers cannot apply for both the wage subsidy and the Essential Workers Leave Scheme. So employers will need to show that they have the ability to support the employees negatively impacted by COVID-19 because of the health restrictions, and also have experienced a minimum of a 30% decline in their actual predicted revenue. So those are the two schemes. I understand that MSD are extremely busy looking into all of the applications. I suspect not all, but many, because they've had many complaints about abusive systems, people applying for schemes when they've made, subsidies when they've made people redundant, and those kind of issues seem to be coming out. So that's the government support package, and I hope many of you are able to take advantage of that scheme. Right, now making workplace changes. Many of you will have made changes or are considering making changes to your employees' terms and conditions of employment as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And there's nothing strange about that. As Amanda said earlier on, all sorts of things are happening. Reduction in hours, reduction of pay, suspension of workers, which Amanda's going to come to. There's a whole variety of things in the workplace, and our workplaces aren't the same as they once were. So many of the changes that you think that you might need to make, well, where do you start? The starting place, of course, with all of these things is employment agreements. See what you've agreed to in writing. Some employment agreements will have pandemic clauses. By that, what do I mean? They have a number of names: force majeure, pandemic, serious incident clauses. They all mean the same thing. They allow the parties to come to an arrangement, whether they're paid or unpaid or whatever the situation might be. So that's the clauses, the kind of clause that you need to go and have a look at. What happens if your employment agreements are silent in these circumstances? Well, and you want to make change. Well, that's where we come into having conversations with your employees. One of the things that this government has been really clear on, time and again, is the employment laws of this country haven't gone out of the window simply because we have a pandemic. And by that, I recall listening to the finance minister saying that good faith continues to apply. Interesting comment. Of course, good faith continues to apply, but what does it mean? It simply means having conversations, consulting with your staff about your business situation, what you propose to do about your business situation, and how you propose to go about that. So there are some employers out there wanting to make pay cuts, and they've got some staff agreeing quite willingly to help the business and help people through this crisis. But there are others who have different circumstances and are saying no to pay cuts. And that's slightly more difficult to manage. Having a discussion about a pay cut with an employee who says, no, I don't want to accept one, can be difficult. Your good faith obligations apply, but ultimately where you wind up with that situation is a redundancy. So the purpose really of your proposal for change is to avoid redundancy. And that's at the kernel of this, and you need to make that quite clear to employees that if there are going to be pay cuts and the employee doesn't agree to it, then the consequences are ultimately you wind up in a redundancy. There's an awful lot of process to go through before you get there, and if you are in that situation, I suggest that you contact either Amanda or myself to discuss how best to approach it with individual staff. I mentioned there using leave entitlements, including book leave. This has become a little bit of an issue for some employers, asking, or they may get requests from employees requesting their salary be topped up. They're currently receiving 80%. They want to top up to 100% by using an annual leave day. Conceptually, I can see nothing wrong with doing that. For example, if your employee is full-time and he works from Monday to Friday, and he's currently only working Monday to Thursday and wants to take Friday as an annual leave day, well, that conveniently works quite nicely, doesn't it? And so I can see no reason why. Forcing employees to take holidays, that also has been quite a controversial aspect of this process. Most employers by now will know that you can ask employees to take 14 days notice annual leave. But please be careful, if they're on annual leave, they can't be doing work for you. And that is a trap. Some employees, I can imagine there will be some disputes in the future about this, saying, well, I couldn't take leave for proper rest and recreation because I was in lockdown. And that may be, in the future, we may see some cases coming through the employment courts for interpretation around that.
And another thing around the giving notice too is if you're wanting them to take sort of half a day or a day every week or every month or whatever, combined with some reduced hours, that's a bit niggly if you end up trying to give the 14 days notice in terms of how you need to specify that. So that's something that's worth talking to us about as well. There are ways that we can kind of cut it to achieve a similar effect. But yeah, you just have to be careful around that type of proposition as well.
I've also come across the situation where employees have booked leave and now can't take it because they can't go overseas or can't go anywhere due to lockdown. What does the employer do in these circumstances? Unfortunately, the Holidays Act is not very helpful in this regard. And it will be a matter of discussion between the employer and employee about reinstating that leave or not. And as I said, there's nothing in the Act that assists an employer, and whether they're entitled to or can be forced to reinstate leave is a very good question, and I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that. I suspect being decent might be the answer to it. The final point I want to make is unilateral variation. I've kind of touched on it with the good faith obligations. One of the cornerstones of employment law is you can't change an employee's terms and conditions without their agreement. And we all understand that. And hence, you need their agreement by consulting with them, telling them what the options might be if agreement can't be reached. And so you need to be very careful about just unilaterally making some changes. One of the more concerning areas I've come across is employers asking employees to take a wage cut, but they want the employees to continue to work their full allocation of hours. Now, I see that as being quite problematic. It's far easier if the hours match the pay, to use an expression. So if they're only going to work 80%, then you're quite justified in paying them 80%. But if you only want to pay them 80% and expect them to work 100% of the hours, then that could be a problem for you in the future. Next slide, I think. Amanda, it's back to you.
Yeah, so just going to talk a wee bit about suspension for a wee bit. So this is not, the word suspension has been used a lot, but it's different from when we're suspending people for disciplinary reasons. So it's more suspending the services of the employee, or, you know, as we go into more permanent forms of this, you might refer to it as hibernation and that type of thing. So where, and I guess the phraseology came out of a lot of these pandemic clauses that Anthony referred to, because a lot of those say that you can suspend the services of the employee or you can terminate and that type of thing. So that's a good way. And if you found that you don't have one of those clauses, that's something to seriously think about putting in, should we ever have to go through this again, into your employment agreements. So if you're going to go through suspension, then process is really important. And this is where we fall back on our usual employment law requirements around good faith and natural justice, in the sense that you need to seek the employee's feedback and input before you go ahead and make a decision. So when we went into level 4 lockdown, there were a lot of employers who were just dictating to their staff what needed to happen around their working and payment. And really at that stage there wasn't a lot we could do about the fact that the government had required us to all stay at home, but there was still a lot to consult about in terms of the way that staff were paid. And as we went through these processes with numerous employers, it was, you know, there were so many different iterations of how you can skin the cat, so to speak. Every business was in a different situation in terms of whether they could afford to top up to the 80% that they were saying they would use best endeavours to do under the wage subsidy declaration. And we saw a lot of cascading models where employers would start off at a certain point and reduce, and some that were just paying the wage subsidy. But alongside that, that's sort of the method of payment during the lockdown. But alongside that, a lot of staff were, services were suspended. And that's basically everyone who couldn't work from home. So it is really important to make sure that the correct process is followed. It's a similar concept to a lot of the other employment processes. It's just that the detail differs. So it's putting a proposal to the employee, spelling out the reasons. So the reasons were fairly well known, but it was important, and this still applies if anyone's needing to do this, important to spell out the reasons from this business's point of view and the consequences on work, and why it is that these roles need to be suspended. As we move through the levels, we are seeing situations of some staff being able to return to work and some needing to stay on suspension. So in that case, we need to be able to objectively distinguish or justify why these ones have to stay at home and these ones don't. So you just need to be thinking about all of those things as well. Level 3 didn't change things for some businesses. Others, as we've talked about, could open, and so some were needing to extend suspension. So some had talked about to the end of level 4, so there's a need to then pick up the process and continue that consultation with staff. Others are able to open at level 3, but as we talked about before, haven't had the full suite of work available, so are either bringing some staff back and not others, or bringing all staff back but on reduced hours. And so depending on how the clauses in your employment agreement are drafted, some of those staff members are still on a partial suspension. So once you've set out that proposal for all of these processes, you obviously need to get the staff members' feedback. Obviously, we have not been able to meet face-to-face, so it has become accepted for these employment processes to have written feedback, phone feedback, video conference feedback and meetings, basically using the tools that we are allowed to use if we can't meet face-to-face, and that has, I think, is a pretty reasonable approach. And then carefully considering that feedback before any decisions are issued. As we go into level 2, so we'll get sort of the detail of level 2 on Thursday, and then Monday we'll see when and if this magical level 2 happens. There will obviously be more businesses that are able to open, and so there's going to be quite an influx of those who have been unable to have their staff at work during 4 and 3 levels, who will be lifting suspensions or perhaps looking at partial lifting of suspensions for the reasons that I just talked about. This could also feed into the process around reduced hours and pay that Anthony has talked about. What we're finding is that it's a bit of a hybrid. We're looking at various different methods, putting it into the one process. Certainly it's artificial, I think, to say, oh, well, we're just going to talk to you about this, but let's talk to them holistically and for a period of time. So when we locked down, we were like, let's work out what we can do for the period of lockdown, or if some businesses couldn't see that, let's sort it for a couple of weeks period, so that we're not going back to staff all the time and having to consult, but B, it provides sort of a regime or a formula for how we're going to work from here. So if you are looking at that in sort of a model involving the reduced hours, etc., as Anthony said, you need to be justifying why that is. And that, I think, is why quite a few workplaces are doing a bit of a rotation, or trying to give all staff a similar amount of work, so that they don't run into those troubles of, well, why did that person get to go back to work and I didn't? And also we've got the wage subsidy sitting there for those who have applied for it. So another thing that has caused a bit of confusion is that is to assist businesses to keep people employed. It's not just for the lockdown. So there have been some workers saying, oh, well, now that we're not locked down, can you give me that money? And it's like, no, that money is to assist the business to continue to keep you employed. So if you are working, it will go towards your wages. And so having that wage subsidy means that up to that's a certain level of work out of everybody. So it really does pay to have quite a bit of thought into these things. So those are sort of a lot of what we're seeing, those sort of combinations of those types of arrangements. What then sort of follows on from that is the potential redundancies. And look, we've had lots of conversations about redundancies, and a lot even before lockdown. And I think the wage subsidy has achieved the outcome that it wanted to in a lot of cases. Certainly a lot of people that I've been speaking with, that people are saying, oh, well, because we've made this declaration to retain people, then we will try and keep them. And practically, it means that there is some cash that can be paid to staff members. And if nothing else, especially when businesses haven't been able to operate, being able to pass on that wage subsidy has worked quite well for a lot of businesses. The reference to the wage subsidy is quite tricky. So before the 27th of March, it was use best endeavours to retain staff. And then after that date, it changed to an obligation to retain the staff that you'd claim the wage subsidy for that 12-week period. So that in itself has postponed a lot of those redundancy processes. It hasn't postponed a lot of the discussions, and I think it doesn't take a rocket scientist to work out that when the wage subsidy comes to an end, and probably this wage subsidy, there will be a lot more of this in terms of redundancies. On that, they said yesterday, didn't they, that they are looking at extending the wage subsidy for certain industries or sectors. So that's what we're expecting to see come out. But we're also expecting that would be a separate declaration potentially. And so, there'll be a choice as to whether or not people take on that new extension if they are entitled to, if they fall into one of the sectors. And another thing that's been floating around is whether an employer who chooses not to take the wage subsidy so they can make redundancies is actually acting in good faith, which is a really fraught question, really. But if a company does find itself in a situation where it needs to make redundancies, if it has applied for and obtained the wage subsidy, then there needs to be a careful conversation around that and timing. But noting that there are, you need to look at notice periods, because you can use the wage subsidy for a notice period, and then time to run a process. So for argument's sake, if you've got a month's long notice period and you're allowing a couple of weeks for a process, then halfway through the wage subsidy period may be a time where you can be having that conversation. And it's something to be careful of, because there is also a potential argument that those who are lining up just to take full advantage of the wage subsidy and make people redundant the minute that expires may not be good faith either, in terms, or may not be meeting the spirit of the declaration that was made. So once again, we always have to come back to what is the true reasoning for this business, and does this business need to take this step? And if looking objectively at all of the information, that is what's needed, well, then that's the unfortunate step that might need to be taken. And so we go back to usual principles in terms of redundancies, and that same sort of process that I talked about before, about putting a proposal to staff, receiving their feedback before making a decision. This decision, in my view, is a much more significant and serious decision if your proposal is to disestablish roles. And in the speed, in the stress and the flurry of lockdown, a lot of timeframes were reduced in terms of the consultation, because things had to be done, because the government, although it thinks it gave some notice, in employment law terms, there wasn't enough time to do what we needed to do before lockdown. But when you're starting to talk about redundancies, our view is that you need to be giving people reasonable periods of time to be considering the proposal, providing feedback, and our usual timeframes that we would be looking at. And once again, really getting into the reasons, you need to be prepared that whatever you talk about in your reasons, so you need to line it up carefully. and that any references that you make, you are prepared to provide that information. So the key one that's often referred to as financial information or declines in revenue and things like that. And that's something to be quite careful about, because there have been case law on this topic. So for a long time, the court said that they wouldn't inquire into the business's prerogative to restructure or reorganise their business. But over time, there was a series of case law in which they did get a bit niggly into criticising what employers were doing, with the result being that personal grievances were found and those employers had to pay money, which is quite a difficult situation for a company to be in, when the very reason that they've made people redundant is usually because they can't afford to keep them, and then they've got to pay out money. So it's absolutely important in this environment to make sure that any redundancies are done correctly.
I think just a point to add to that, if the courts get half a cent or an inkling that there's an improper motive to make somebody redundant, they will look extremely hard at the employer's reasoning and process. And I think that won't change just because of COVID-19. So if you're thinking about getting rid of your dead wood, be really careful how you manage it.
Yeah, you have to be really thorough. And you know, examples of that is one case where they specified the actual saving that they were going to make, and when you drilled down into it, by removing this role, they weren't attaining that saving. It was less than that, and so the court used that to say, well, that's, you know, not justified. So you need to be really careful with your reasons. Redeployment is another area where case law has been very harsh. You can't, just because you don't want this person in the role anymore, you've got to be quite alive to the court's requirements about redeploying people into roles, even if they need training. So it might be that you're removing a few roles, not all of the roles, and you're moving roles around and creating some more. And there's quite a lot of legal requirement about who has to be considered for these roles. In the days of saying, oh, well, we want to get some fresh blood in and I'm going to put that out to the market, when you've got people whose roles are being disestablished, who arguably on paper could do that job, even if they need some training, it's really difficult. Those days are gone, and you've got to, there's a lot of work in getting all of those matters lined up. So what we always suggest is to have a sit down. We sit down and nut it out with you so that you get it right, and then the drafting of the proposal can come from that. But there's a lot of people have these ideas of what they want to do, and it doesn't always fit with the law, and that's where they get tripped up. So yeah, and so that's really important. And then just making sure that the process itself is adhered to, and the risks, of course, I've noted as we've gone on in terms of personal grievances and things like that, and those can be on the grounds that it was not a genuine reason, or that the process wasn't fair and reasonable. So that's why you've got to attack all of those things right from the outset, have a good, robust process, and actually make sure that the reasons are well spelt out. And you might, in this environment, there will be very genuine reasons, but if you don't spell it out properly, then you're going to be tripped up.
I'll just make one final comment on the risks here. Reinstatement has obvious risks for employers, and you need to have that in the back of your mind. Post this lockdown period, jobs are more important than ever before, and to be able to retain jobs will be important, and I anticipate employees will fight for their jobs. Just have that in the back of your mind.
Yeah, and also thinking, you know, do I need this? If I don't need this person now, am I going to need this role in a few months' time? Because you might find them either knocking on your door then, or challenging then that maybe you should have had some other thing and step in place, and that's the types of things that we talked about earlier around reducing pay and, you know, those other sort of combinations of steps have been to date some true alternatives to redundancy. So it's really worth working it through. I do recognise that a lot of this is just a holding pattern though for businesses, and that the time will come where that decision has to be turned in or crystallised. So yeah, so that's redundancies. That we're going to see a lot more on that front as we move forward. Health and safety. Well, there's quite a bit on health and safety. This is me again. So I guess the key message is health and safety remains in place. So all of the stuff that we have in place is key and still applies. We now have this overlay of COVID and needing to respond to it. And as I said before, it's this interesting health element to our health and safety, which has always been there, but perhaps not always thought about. So, so you still have this duty to eliminate risk to workers' health, and if that elimination is not possible, to minimise risk. As a part of that, there's been quite a lot done at level 4, and that continues into level 3 with COVID safety plans being required for workplaces. And there's quite a bit involved in that, but a lot of it's common sense, and the key messages that we've been hearing around minimising risk, like separation distances and disinfecting and hygiene and hand washing and records and contact tracing, all of that type of stuff. But every workplace does need to turn its mind to those matters and record it in a plan. Doesn't have to go to WorkSafe, but it proves your record that you've been through that exercise that you need to do, and you need to communicate that with your staff. We're expecting in the shift to level 2 that will be required. So for those who are unable to go back to their workplaces until level 2, now is a wonderful time to be working on that. And it's something that we've been helping a lot of employers with in terms of general health and safety policies, because they've realised they don't really have one. Specific COVID-19 policies that talk about the high level steps that are needed to be taken, and then also around the safety plans themselves. So it's really that demonstration that you can work safely. We shouldn't forget that employees also have an obligation, so they've got to make sure that they don't cause harm to themselves or to other people, and they have an obligation to follow instructions. So employers can quite rightly expect that staff will comply with the steps that employers put in place to deal with COVID, provided it's reasonable, of course. And that's where where the debate will lie in a lot of cases. And so provided that it's a reasonable step, then you can expect them to do those things. And there's quite a few different sort of techniques that are being employed, especially at level 3. There's a lot of dividing into teams. Some teams are going in 1 week or one period of time. Others are going in another period of time, cleaning between. And that becomes a health and safety and an employment issue, because you need to deal with the employment process around that as well as the health and safety side of things. So there's also consequences if you don't have the appropriate safety plans in place, and that there is the ability for staff members to strike if they've got reasonable grounds to believe that it's justified for health and safety reasons. And there's also the ability for workers to, for employers to lock out workers who on the grounds of health and safety as well. Now, I don't think it should ever come to that, and I think it's just more that employers get on and have a reasonable, safe plan for people to be in the workplace. And what we're seeing is that workers are pretty genuinely wanting to assist with that. I guess, their health is at risk as well. And I think from the health side of things, workers can much more easily see that. Whereas with the safety side, you know, I'm going to end up with an injury. They always think that won't happen to me. But it seems to be feeling a bit more personal for a lot of workers. So that's something to focus on. If you haven't already, probably the key takeaway in terms of that is to get working on your safety plan and making sure that your policies are in place. Anthony, you're going to look into a crystal ball. I'm not sure whether you bought it from the $2 shop or whether it's a magic one.
Yeah, I must admit, I wanted to end our seminar or workshop today on a positive note and talk about some of the lockdown lessons. What have we learnt so far? Well, physical distancing, and that's probably going to remain for some time, no matter what level we're at. I don't know whether any of you have walked down your local streets lately, but everybody seems to want to avoid each other. We've also learned about personal hygiene and how important it is to wash your hands. It's the main weapon to combat COVID-19. We've learnt life over livelihood, and we're about to turn that round, aren't we, when we get back to work properly. We've learnt about alternative ways of working, and one of the key things there are having robust systems in place so that you can work in alternative ways. Some of the other things that we have learnt, maybe not quite so good, like don't attend a Zoom meeting from your bathroom. Don't get caught out wearing your pajamas while at a Zoom meeting because you're running late. And the most important issue, or second most important issue, is where on earth are our hairdressers and barbers? And just in that same sort of theme, who would have thought that we would crave Zoom meetings just to maintain social connections? So, boy, have we come a long way in 6 weeks. Our lives have changed and probably changed forever. Now, I just want to focus a little bit on the future and what that crystal ball might look like. What I do know is businesses must operate safely. And what does that mean? Well, if we do and go to a lower level coming weeks, we're still going to need to meet appropriate public health requirements for the workplace. And what does that mean? Well, having contact tracing systems in place, a plan, all of those kinds of things. We're still going to need to fulfill all our health and safety obligations. Businesses are still going to need to encourage the use of alternative ways of working for a period of time, if that's possible. And businesses can open for staff and customers and services and all of those kinds of things, provided their premises can manage. And just in some final thoughts, balancing the public health against the economic impact. We know the socio-economic costs of COVID-19 are huge or have been huge to date, and they'll continue to be that way. For you and businesses, you need to understand what your key risks are so that your organisation is resilient and can recover and recover quickly. As Amanda mentioned, reshaping and restructuring businesses, including the way we work, will be our new norm from now till who knows when. My final and passing thought before we get into the questions is a thought for you. I think competence will be our new black. We're open for questions.
So in order to do that, I need to stop the sharing. So feel free to put some questions into chat if you like. Someone has asked me, can I explain what suspension is? It was a while ago, so I may have answered it, but just for completeness. So that is where we are temporarily dispensing with the employee services. So over lockdown, that was where they couldn't work remotely, so couldn't conduct any work. So we're suspending the need for the employees to attend work, and depending on the clauses in your employment agreement, some of those, if you've got them drafted well, allow you to suspend your obligation to make payment to staff members at the same time. So so that's loosely what that involves, and then we've talked about it partially as well.
Just to add to that, Amanda, to be clear, we're not talking about a misconduct situation, which most people will understand, that people could be stood down or suspended from work while a misconduct matter was investigated. We're not talking about that kind of suspension.
Yeah. One person has asked, given some of the changes, are we able to reallocate them from one function to another, or one role to another, for a specified time? Yes, you can. Now, the many employment agreements have the ability for an employer to move someone or reassign duties. And if you've got one of those employment agreements, then and it's really only that person, then you could probably have a conversation with them around that. But what we're finding is that there seems to be wholesale changes needed to most staff members, and actually it's safer to consult, and the way that you prove you've consulted is to do a process with written documents. So that is the best way to do that, but it is absolutely an option, provided it's not completely ridiculous that what you're expecting the person to do, and you know, where it's an alternative to them having nothing to do and potentially being redundancy, then that helps it to look more reasonable too.
I've always understood that concept of your job may have a bundle of duties in it, and an employer's always had the right or the prerogative to ask you to focus in one area or another, or in many areas. And simply what you're doing during the current crisis is asking you to focus on perhaps some different areas within those parameters.
Next question, Anthony, do you want to have a crack at this one? What if the employer wants to reduce hours but also alter the bonus package and perks and the KPIs that are measured, which eventually mean that there's no way the KPIs can be met?
I would say you're asking for trouble with that. Can you do it? Well, you're going to have to sit down with the employee and have a pretty serious discussion as to why you're wanting to change that. Obviously, it's going to be difficult enough for an employee to meet KPIs this year because of what's happened. And so it may be appropriate to ask for them to be remeasured or recast. The difficulty is if they can't meet the recast KPIs, that also is problematic. Bonuses always are. In relation to your other matters, again, they're all matters for consultation, and hopefully you can get an agreement.
Yeah. And it comes down to what's the justification for it. If it's an alternative to redundancy, and you know, a lot of businesses can't afford to be paying out sort of bonus or additional sums. Often bonuses are linked to performance of the company as well. But yeah, as Anthony said, it's a process. Are we seeing an increased number of grievances since the increased number of job losses? I tell you what has been really bizarre is the willingness and uptake of staff members to agree to the changes that are being proposed by employers. It's almost during lockdown, the lack of objection was just, and understanding was overwhelming, and some employers were just so blown away by it. What we then saw was when for the ones that were locked down completely and couldn't work, they were expected to come back to full hours and full pay. There was quite a bit of that. But you said we were on reduced pay until the end of lockdown. Well, it didn't quite say that, but they read it that way, that it was only until then. And now you're asking me to come to work. So in terms of formal grievances, it's been surprisingly lower, but we think it'll come, don't we?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's right.
Well, okay. If you make I'm not reading these before I read them out. I'm a bit worried. It might be dodgy. No. If you make a proposal to all staff about temporary changes and some staff negotiate those, can we go ahead with the proposal with those that accept and have changes agreed with individuals who negotiate, i.e. different changes for different staff? Look, I think that's fine. You've gone through the process. You have to start from a starting point of treating people consistently, don't they?
Yeah.
And just always have a justification for it, like not just because you like the person, but actually this person's brought to my attention that they have to do X, Y, Z. And so, yes, we will accommodate that point and reach agreement with them and get it signed off.
The bottom line here is you've got to be fair to both the business and the employee concerned. Treat them as individuals and be fair to them.
So that's probably a good time, because that's the last question I've got there, and we've gone over our hour. We were conscious not to take up too much of your time. We get completely zoomed out, don't we? Anthony and I are here on the end of our mobiles, which was up on the last slide that I have now got rid of, but is on our website and on our emails. So feel free to pick up the phone and talk to us about these issues. We're in a completely different environment than we have been, remembering we do have to still meet employment law requirements, but the application of that, we've had heaps of experience doing that. Even though it's only been however many weeks, we've done just so many. So even what we're seeing from other people, and sometimes even the discussion is just not knowing that you're not the only ones, or you're not alone in having these issues, and we can help you find the way through dealing with them, can't we, Anthony?
Yeah.
So thanks for joining us, everyone. I'm sorry about my lack of technical skills at the beginning, but I think we got there in the end. So enjoy the rest of your day, and reach out if you want to chat.